The girl in the attic. The morning light filtered through the grimy attic window, casting long shadows across the cramped space that Aiko called home. Dust motes danced in the pale sunbeams, the only movement in the suffocating stillness that had become her world. She pulled the thin blanket closer around her shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in her bones from sleeping on the hard wooden floor. Downstairs, the sounds of a real family beginning their day drifted up through the floorboards, the clatter of dishes, the cheerful chatter of her cousins getting ready for school, the warm voice of her aunt calling out breakfast instructions. It was a symphony of belonging that Aiko could only listen to, never join. She pressed her ear against the floor, straining to catch fragments of conversation. Her male cousin, Daisuke, was complaining about a math test. Her female cousin, Yumi, was asking for money for a school trip. Normal problems, normal requests, normal love. The sharp rap of knuckles against the attic door made her flinch. "Aiko! Get down here now!" Her aunt's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, all warmth evaporating from its tone. Aiko's stomach clenched, not from hunger, though she was always hungry, but from the familiar dread that accompanied any summons from below. She scrambled to her feet, her legs stiff from the cold, and quickly folded her blanket. The attic was so small she could barely stand upright without hitting her head on the slanted ceiling. As she descended the narrow wooden ladder that served as her only connection to the world below, the sounds and smells of family life grew stronger. The rich aroma of miso soup and grilled fish made her mouth water, even as her heart sank. She knew that feast wasn't meant for her. The kitchen was warm and bright, everything the attic wasn't. Daisuke and Yumi sat at the table in their crisp school uniforms, backpacks ready by their chairs, lunchboxes packed with care. They looked up when she entered, Daisuke with mild curiosity, Yumi with the casual indifference reserved for unwanted house guests. Her aunt, Mariko, stood by the stove with her back turned, her posture rigid with perpetual disapproval. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, her hair always perfectly styled, her clothes always pressed. Everything about her spoke of order and control. Everything except her treatment of Aiko. "You're going to be late for school," Mariko said without turning around. Again. Aiko glanced at the clock on the wall. She had plenty of time, but she'd learned not to argue. "Yes, Aunt Mariko." "Don't call me that." The words were sharp, final. "You know the rules." Aiko's cheeks burned. She was to call her aunt Mrs. Tanaka like a stranger, never family, never acknowledge the blood connection that linked her to these people who shared her mother's face but none of her warmth. "Yes, Mrs. Tanaka." Mariko finally turned, her eyes scanning Aiko with the same expression she might use when examining spoiled food. Aiko instinctively raised her hand to her hair, knowing what she would see there. The matted, unwashed strands hung limp around her shoulders, and she could feel the telltale itch that meant her scalp was once again infested with lice. "Disgusting," Mariko muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How can you go to school looking like that?" "Do you want to embarrass this family more than you already have?" Daisuke snickered into his breakfast. Yumi wrinkled her nose and moved her chair slightly away, as if Aiko's presence might contaminate her perfect morning routine. "I'm sorry," Aiko whispered, the words automatic after years of practice. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Mariko snapped. "Sorry doesn't bring back what your mother took from this family. Sorry doesn't—" She stopped herself, her jaw clenching as if she'd said more than she intended. Aiko's heart leaped at the mention of her mother. Any crumb of information about the woman she barely remembered was precious, even when it came wrapped in anger and resentment. "What did my mother—" "Don't!" The word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare ask about her!" "You have no right." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Daisuke and Yumi exchanged glances, suddenly uncomfortable with the familiar tension that always surrounded discussions of Aiko's mother. They might not like Aiko, but even they seemed to sense that their mother's hatred ran deeper than mere inconvenience. Mariko turned back to the stove, her movements sharp and angry. "There's rice from last night in the pot. Take some and get out of my sight." And Aiko... She paused, not bothering to look back. "Come straight home after school. No detours, no wandering, do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs. Tanaka." Aiko moved quickly to the rice cooker, taking a small portion into a chipped bowl. The rice was cold and hard, having sat out all night, but it was food. She'd learned to be grateful for whatever she could get. As she turned to leave, Yumi spoke up for the first time. "You, Mom, she's going to make everyone at school think we don't take care of ourselves. Can't you at least make her wash her hair?" "With what?" Mariko's voice dripped with false sweetness. "Should I buy special shampoo for the girl who contributes nothing to this household? Should I waste our money on someone who's already proven she's worthless?" Aiko's fingers tightened around the bowl, the ceramic edges cutting into her palms. Each word was a small violence, precisely aimed to hurt. But beneath the hurt, a small flame of anger flickered. Her mother hadn't been worthless. Her mother had been famous, successful, loved by people all over the city for her incredible talent with hair. She knew this much, even if no one would tell her more. I'll figure something out," Aiko said quietly. Mariko's laugh was cold. "Yes, you do that. Figure it out. Just like your mother figured everything out before she..." Again, she stopped herself, biting off the words like bitter medicine. Aiko wanted to scream, to demand answers, to know what terrible thing her mother had supposedly done that made her own family treat her daughter like a disease. But she'd learned that pushing only made things worse. Instead, she bowed her head and headed for the door. "Remember," Mariko called after her, "straight home after school. I'll know if you go anywhere else, and if you embarrass this family today, there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air like smoke as Aiko gathered her worn school bag and stepped out into the morning. The fresh air was a relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the house, but it couldn't wash away the weight of her aunt's words. As she walked toward school, Aiko caught her reflection in a shop window and winced. Her uniform was clean, but faded from too many washings, hanging loose on her thin frame. Her shoes were scuffed and worn, held together more by hope than by leather. But it was her hair that made her want to disappear entirely. The lice had returned with a vengeance, making her scalp itch constantly. She could see the tiny insects moving in the matted strands, and she knew that anyone who looked closely would see them too. At school, it would mean more whispers, more pointing, more of the casual cruelty that children wielded like weapons. She pulled her hood up, trying to hide the worst of it, but she knew it was futile. In a few hours, she'd be sitting in class, trying to focus on lessons while scratching desperately at her scalp, watching her classmates edge away from her like she was something contagious. Maybe she was. The walk to school took her through the older part of town, where narrow streets wound between traditional wooden houses and small family businesses. This early in the morning, the shopkeepers were just beginning to open their doors, sweeping their stoops and arranging their displays. Some nodded politely as she passed. Others pretended not to see her at all. She paused outside Mrs. Yamamoto's small grocery store, watching the elderly woman carefully arrange pyramids of perfect apples in her window. Mrs. Yamamoto had known her mother, had sometimes spoken kindly to Aiko when she was very young. But that was before Mariko had made it clear that such kindness was unwelcome, that Aiko was not to be treated as anything more than a burden to be endured. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Yamamoto called out, her voice gentle. "You're up early today." Aiko managed a small smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Yamamoto." The old woman's eyes softened as she took in Aiko's appearance, lingering on the poorly concealed hair. For a moment, Aiko thought she might say something, might offer help or at least sympathy. Instead, Mrs. Yamamoto's expression grew sad and she simply nodded. "Have a good day at school," she said quietly, turning back to her apples. Even kindness felt like pity now. And pity was almost harder to bear than outright cruelty. At least cruelty was honest about what it thought of her. The school building loomed ahead, a modern concrete structure that always made Aiko feel small and insignificant. Students were already gathering in the courtyard, clustering in their familiar groups, sharing snacks and gossip and the easy camaraderie of belonging. Aiko pulled her hood lower and hurried toward the entrance, hoping to slip inside unnoticed. But hope was a luxury she'd learned not to indulge. "Oh, gross, look who's here," a voice called out behind her. "It's the bug girl." Aiko's steps faltered, but she didn't turn around. She knew that voice. Takeshi, a boy in her class who seemed to take particular pleasure in making her life miserable. "Hey, bug girl, I'm talking to you." This time she did turn, slowly, dreading what she would see. Takeshi stood with 3 of his friends, all of them grinning with the anticipation of entertainment. He held something in his hand, small, dark, moving. "Look what I found," he said, holding up a love bug, its wings iridescent in the morning light. "I thought you might be lonely without your little friends." The other students in the courtyard had started to notice, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, but none stepped forward to help. They never did. "Please," Aiko whispered, taking a step back. "Just leave me alone." "Leave you alone?" Takeshi's voice rose in mock outrage. "But you love bugs, don't you? That's why you keep so many of them in your hair." Before she could react, he lunged forward and pressed the love bug into her tangled hair, grinding it in with the palm of his hand. The insect's wings crumpled as other students laughed and pointed, some pulling out their phones to record her humiliation. "There," Takeshi said, wiping his hand on his uniform with exaggerated disgust. "Now you match." Aiko's hands flew to her hair, feeling for the crushed insect among the existing lice and tangles. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. "You don't touch it," one of the girls called out. "You'll get infected too." "Maybe we should call the health department," another voice suggested, prompting more laughter. The circle of students pressed closer, their phones capturing every moment of her shame. This would be online within minutes, shared and reshared until everyone in school had seen proof of her degradation. "That's enough." The voice was stern, authoritative. Mr. Sato, her homeroom teacher, pushed through the crowd with a thunderous expression. "All of you, get to class, now." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, disappointed that their entertainment had been cut short. Takeshi shot Aiko one last grin before sauntering away, his friends trailing behind him like disciples. Mr. Sato knelt down beside Aiko, his voice gentle. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Her fingers were still tangled in her hair, trying to extract the dead love bug while avoiding the live lice that scattered at her touch. "Let me help," he said, reaching toward her hair. "No!" The word burst out of her sharper than she'd intended. "I mean, please don't. I can handle it." Mr. Sato's hand dropped, his expression pained. He was a good man, she knew, one of the few adults who treated her with consistent kindness. But even he couldn't fix what was fundamentally broken about her situation. "Aiko," he said quietly. "You know I have to report this incident. And I really think we should call your guardian about getting you some help with—" "Please don't," she interrupted, panic rising in her chest. "Please, Mr. Sato. It'll only make things worse." He studied her face for a long moment, seeing more than she wanted to reveal. Finally, he nodded. "Go clean up in the bathroom," he said. "Take your time. I'll mark you present for first period." Aiko nodded gratefully and hurried inside, her face burning with shame. The bathroom was mercifully empty, and she locked herself in the farthest stall, finally allowing the tears to fall. Her hands shook as she tried to untangle the dead love bug from her hair, its broken body a grotesque reminder of how others saw her. She was the bug girl, the dirty girl, the girl who carried pestilence and shame wherever she went. But as she worked, pulling lice and debris from her matted hair, a memory surfaced, faint and precious, like light filtering through deep water. Her mother's hands, gentle and sure, working through Aiko's hair with infinite patience. Her mother's voice, soft and musical, singing lullabies that spoke of love and beauty and dreams that soared beyond the mundane world. Her mother had been a hairstylist, she knew that much. A famous one, whose work had graced magazine covers and red carpets. People had traveled from other cities just to have her mother touch their hair, to transform them into something beautiful and confident. What would her mother think if she could see Aiko now? The question was too painful to contemplate, but it planted a seed of something that might have been determination. Her mother had made people beautiful, had given them confidence and joy through the simple act of caring for their hair. Maybe there was something of that gift in Aiko too, buried beneath years of neglect and abuse. Maybe she didn't have to stay the bug girl forever. The thought was so fragile, so dangerous, that she almost discarded it immediately. Hope had always led to disappointment in her experience. But as she finally extracted the last of the dead love bug from her hair, something inside her refused to let the idea go. She would find a way to learn about hair, about beauty, about the art that had made her mother famous. She would discover what her aunt so desperately wanted to keep hidden about her mother's life and death. And maybe someday, she would transform herself from the girl everyone pitied into someone worthy of the legacy she'd inherited. It was a dream so distant it seemed impossible, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough to keep going. The school bell rang, signaling the start of first period, and Aiko dried her tears. She had classes to attend, homework to complete, another day of survival to endure. But beneath it all, a small flame had been kindled, one that all the cruelty in the world couldn't quite extinguish. She was more than the bug girl. She had to be. And someday she would prove it. Episode 2, Rainy Storm Park. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves as Aiko hurried down the hill toward the small park, her worn shoes scuffing against the cracked pavement. Her scalp itched terribly, and she could feel the familiar weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. At 14, Aiko had learned to make herself invisible. It was easier that way, easier than dealing with the stares, the whispered comments, the way other students would edge away from her in class. The lice in her matted hair had made her a pariah at school, and her aunt's neglect meant there was no relief waiting at home. The park was nearly empty at this hour, just a few elderly people feeding pigeons and some cyclists passing through on their way to more interesting destinations. Aiko found her usual spot on a bench near the water fountain, where she could sit and pretend, for just a little while, that she belonged somewhere. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her thin arms around them. The attic where she slept was cold and cramped, but at least here she could breathe. Here, she could dream about the mother she barely remembered, the famous hairstylist whose legacy felt as distant as the stars. The sound of bicycle wheels on gravel made her look up. A group of cyclists was passing by, their colorful jerseys bright against the gray afternoon. Most barely glanced her way, but one boy, perhaps a year or two older than herself, slowed his bike as he approached. Aiko instinctively ducked her head, pulling her hood up to hide her hair. But it was too late. The boy had already seen. He came to a complete stop, balancing on his bike with practiced ease. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear entirely. When she finally dared to look up, she was surprised to find not disgust in his expression, but something closer to concern. "Excuse me," he said, his accent marking him as foreign. "Spanish, maybe? Are you all right?" Aiko's cheeks burned. Of course he could see the state she was in. The tangled hair, the obvious neglect, the way she hunched in on herself like a wounded animal. "I'm fine," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. The boy didn't move. Behind him, his cycling group was pulling ahead, but he seemed oblivious to their departure. "Your hair," he said gently. "It needs help." The words should have stung, but something in his tone, kind, professional, matter-of-fact, made them bearable. When Aiko looked at him more closely, she noticed the expensive cycling gear, the confidence in his posture, and something else. A small pendant around his neck that caught the light. "I know," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I can't. There's nothing I can do about it." The boy studied her for another moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Wait here," he said, parking his bike against a nearby tree. "I'll be right back." Episode 3, The Rainy Eyes. Before Aiko could protest, he was jogging away, leaving his expensive bicycle unattended. She stared after him in confusion. Who was this stranger, and why did he care about the state of her hair? True to his word, he returned within 30 minutes carrying a small bag. Without a word, he gestured toward the water fountain. "Come on, let me help." "I don't understand," Aiko stammered. "Why would you—" "My sister," he explained, already pulling supplies from his bag. Gentle shampoo, a wide-tooth comb, something that looked like conditioning treatment. "She's a hairstylist. A very good one. When I see hair that's been neglected like this." He shrugged. "I can't just walk away." Slowly, as if in a dream, Aiko allowed him to guide her to the fountain. The water was cold, but his hands were gentle as he worked the shampoo through her tangled hair. She had never experienced such careful attention, such patient kindness from a stranger. The rain had started as a light drizzle when the boy began working on Aiko's hair, but now it was coming down in earnest, drumming against the park's few sheltered areas and sending late-afternoon joggers scrambling for cover. Aiko sat perfectly still by the water fountain, hardly daring to breathe as gentle hands worked through her tangled hair with infinite patience. The boy, this mysterious cyclist who had stopped his entire journey just to help her, hummed softly under his breath as he worked, a melody she didn't recognize but found strangely comforting. "There," he said finally, stepping back to admire his work. "Much better." Aiko raised a tentative hand to her hair and gasped. It felt clean, truly clean, for the first time in months. The weight of accumulated dirt and neglect was gone, replaced by hair that actually moved when she touched it, that felt soft beneath her fingers. "How do you know how to do this?" she asked, turning to look at him properly for the first time. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 15 or 16, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that seemed completely natural, despite the strange circumstances of their meeting. Around his neck hung a small pendant that caught the dim light filtering through the storm clouds overhead. "My sister," he said, packing his supplies back into the small bag he'd brought. "She's been teaching me since I was little. Says everyone should know basic hair care, especially if you want to help people." "Your sister is a hairstylist?" "One of the best," he said with obvious pride. "She works with famous people, travels all over the world. But she always says the most important work is helping people feel good about themselves, no matter who they are." The rain was getting heavier now, and Aiko could see him glancing anxiously at his phone. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, about his sister, about hairstyling, about why he'd stopped to help a stranger who probably looked like she belonged in a garbage bin rather than a park. "I should probably," he began, but was cut off by the sharp ring of his phone. Even from where she sat, Aiko could hear the rapid-fire Spanish coming from the speaker, the tone increasingly urgent and concerned. The boy's face went pale as he listened. Sí, lo siento," he said quickly into the phone. "Estoy en camino ahora mismo." When he hung up, he was already reaching for his bicycle. "I have to go," he said, looking genuinely regretful. "My sister is furious that I left the cycling group, and apparently there's a storm warning. We're supposed to be back at the campsite immediately." Thunder rumbled overhead as if to emphasize his point, and the first real drops of heavy rain began to fall. Aiko felt panic rising in her chest, not because of the storm, but because this boy, this moment of unexpected kindness, was about to disappear from her life forever. "Wait!" she called out, scrambling to her feet. "I don't even know your name." He was already mounting his bicycle, but he turned back with that same warm smile. "My name is—" The thunder that followed was unlike anything Aiko had ever heard. It seemed to crack the very sky open, a sound so loud and sudden that it drowned out everything else in the world. She instinctively covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut against the assault of sound. When she opened them again, the boy was already pedaling away through the rapidly intensifying rain, his figure becoming indistinct in the gray curtain of water falling from the sky. "Wait!" she shouted after him, but her voice was lost in the storm. "What's your name?" She thought she heard something carried back on the wind, a word that sounded like Jav, or maybe Ha. But between the thunder, the rain, and the distance growing between them, she couldn't be sure of anything except that he was leaving. Aiko stood there in the downpour, water streaming down her face, her newly clean hair becoming soaked within seconds. But even as the rain undid some of his careful work, she could still feel the difference. Her hair moved differently, felt different. She felt different. As she finally turned to run for shelter, her recollection went to the pendant she'd glimpsed around his neck. In the brief moment when lightning had illuminated the park, she'd seen it clearly. Something decorative and foreign-looking, possibly Spanish, though she couldn't be certain. She took shelter under the pavilion's roof, watching the empty path where he'd disappeared. "Jav," she whispered to herself, testing the sound. It had to be a nickname, maybe short for something longer. A Spanish name, to match the accent she'd heard when he spoke into his phone. The storm raged around her, but Aiko barely noticed. Her mind was racing with possibilities, with questions, with a sudden burning desire to understand what had just happened to her. A complete stranger had seen her at her lowest point and had chosen to help. Not because he had to, not because someone was making him, but simply because he believed she deserved kindness. When the rain finally began to ease, Aiko emerged from her shelter and began the walk home. Her aunt would be furious about her being out in the storm, about her wet clothes and her late return. But for once, Aiko didn't care about the inevitable confrontation waiting for her. She had been seen. Not just noticed or pitied or scorned, but truly seen by someone who had looked past the surface mess and recognized something worth caring for. And in that brief encounter, something fundamental had shifted inside her. By the time she reached her aunt's house, Aiko had made a decision. She was going to learn everything she could about hair, how to care for it, how to style it, how to transform it the way that boy had transformed hers. She was going to discover what her mother had known about this craft that could change not just how someone looked, but how they felt about themselves. And somehow, some way, she was going to find him again. The boy with the Spanish accent and the kind eyes, whose name sounded like Jav, and who had given her the first genuine gift she'd received in years. She touched her damp hair one more time, feeling the promise hidden in its newfound softness. This was just the beginning. Episode 4: The Price of Beauty. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that follows a storm, and Aiko stood before the cracked mirror in the shared bathroom, hardly recognizing herself. Even after the weekend rain had somewhat undone the boy's careful work, her hair still held traces of his kindness. It fell more naturally around her face, caught the light differently, and, most importantly, moved like hair was supposed to move. She had spent Sunday experimenting with the basic techniques she remembered him using, carefully working through her hair with her fingers and some diluted shampoo she'd found under the sink. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The walk to school felt different too. Her steps were lighter, her posture straighter. For the first time in months, she wasn't trying to disappear into herself. She caught her reflection in shop windows and didn't immediately look away in shame. But it was the reaction of her classmates that truly drove home how much had changed. Whoa, Aiko. Mei Tanaka, a girl from her math class, stopped mid-conversation with her friends to stare. Is that really you? The group of girls gathered around Aiko's desk, their expressions ranging from curious to amazed. These were the same girls who had barely acknowledged her existence for months, who had treated her like a piece of furniture they occasionally had to work around. Your hair looks really nice, said Yuri Sano, the unofficial leader of their grade's social hierarchy. What did you do to it? I just washed it properly, Aiko said quietly, still not quite believing this was happening. But how? Pressed another girl, Nana. I mean, it looks like you went to a professional salon or something. Did your aunt finally take you somewhere? The attention was overwhelming. More students were gathering now, drawn by the unusual sight of Aiko being treated like a normal person. Some of the boys had started to notice too, including Takeshi, the same boy who had pressed the love bug into her hair just days earlier. It's like you're a completely different person, Mei said wonderingly. I had no idea your hair could look like that. The compliments kept coming, each one landing on Aiko's heart like drops of healing rain on parched earth. For the first time since starting middle school, she felt visible in a good way, seen as something other than an object of pity or disgust. But not everyone was pleased with her transformation. I don't understand what the big deal is, came a sharp voice from the back of the crowd. Rina Yoshida, one of the more popular girls, pushed through the group with an expression of poorly concealed jealousy. It's just clean hair. That shouldn't be such a shocking accomplishment. The comment stung, but it couldn't completely dampen Aiko's newfound confidence. She had experienced genuine kindness from a stranger, had seen proof that she was worth caring for. No amount of petty cruelty could take that away. The attention continued throughout the day. Teachers did double takes when calling her name. Classmates who had never spoken to her before struck up conversations, and for the first time in months, Aiko felt like she belonged somewhere. It was this glow of acceptance that she carried home with her, this dangerous feeling of hope that made her forget to be careful. She should have known her aunt would notice immediately. What did you do? Aunt Mariko's voice cut through the evening air like a blade as Aiko entered the kitchen for dinner. The familiar knot of anxiety formed in Aiko's stomach, but she tried to maintain some of the confidence she'd felt at school. I washed my hair properly. That's all. That's all? Mariko's voice rose dangerously. You've been walking around looking like a street urchin for months, and suddenly you know how to make yourself presentable? How? Aiko's cousins, Daisuke and Yumi, looked up from their homework with interest. Family drama was always more entertaining than math problems. Someone showed me the right way to do it, Aiko said carefully. Someone? Who someone? Mariko stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. What aren't you telling me? Just someone at the park. They helped me. The slap came so fast Aiko didn't see it coming. Her aunt's hand connected with her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen, leaving her ears ringing and her face stinging. You were at the park? Mariko's voice was deadly quiet now. After I specifically told you to come straight home from school? You were just what? Meeting boys? Drawing attention to yourself like some kind of... Mariko's face twisted with disgust. Just like your mother. What does that mean? Aiko asked, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. What about my mother? Your mother, Mariko spat. Thought she was too good for this family. Thought her precious hair salon and her magazine features made her better than the rest of us. And look where it got her. She was successful, Aiko said desperately. She helped people feel beautiful. What's wrong with that? What's wrong? Mariko's laugh was bitter. What's wrong is that she abandoned her family for strangers. What's wrong is that she cared more about making other people pretty than taking care of her own responsibilities. What's wrong is that she died and left us to clean up her mess. The words hit Aiko like physical blows. How did she die? That's none of your business. Mariko's voice turned cold and final. And you're not going to follow in her footsteps. From now on, you come straight home from school. No stops, no detours, no parks. You go to school and you come home. That's it. But no buts. Mariko grabbed Aiko's chin roughly, forcing her to make eye contact. And if I find out you've been meeting boys or drawing attention to yourself, there will be consequences. Do you understand me? Aiko nodded, tears streaming down her face. Good. Now get out of my sight. And Aiko? Mariko's grip tightened. Wash that nonsense out of your hair. I don't want to see you looking like that again. As Aiko climbed the ladder to her attic room, she could hear her cousins' voices below, already moving on to other topics as if nothing had happened. Her cheek throbbed where her aunt had hit her, and her heart ached with the fresh weight of restrictions that felt like prison bars closing around her life. But as she touched her still soft hair in the darkness of her room, she made a silent promise. Her aunt could slap her, could threaten her, could try to crush every dream she'd ever had. But she couldn't erase what Aiko had learned about herself in that moment of kindness at the park. She was worth caring for. She was capable of transformation. And somehow, some way, she was going to find a path forward, even if she had to walk it in secret. The boy with the kind eyes and the Spanish accent had shown her who she could be. Now it was up to her to figure out how to become that person, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. Her transformation at school had been just the beginning. The real journey was yet to come. Episode 5, Sato Hair Design. 2 weeks had passed since Aunt Mariko's ultimatum, and Aiko felt like she was slowly suffocating. Her hair had returned to its previous neglected state, not because she wanted it to, but because any attempt to care for it properly resulted in suspicious questions and increasingly harsh punishments. The brief taste of acceptance she'd experienced at school had made returning to her invisible existence even more painful. Her classmates had quickly lost interest once her transformation faded, and she was back to being the girl everyone forgot was there. But the memory of those gentle hands working through her hair refused to fade. If anything, it had grown stronger, more vivid, accompanied now by a burning need to understand what her mother's world had really been like. What had driven her aunt to such fury at the mere mention of hairstyling? What terrible thing had supposedly happened that made Mariko so determined to keep Aiko away from anything connected to beauty or transformation? It was during one of her mandatory walks to and from school, the only time she was allowed outside the house, that Aiko found herself standing before a small salon on Maple Street. She'd passed it dozens of times before, but today something made her stop and really look. The sign above the door read, Sato Hair Design, in elegant script, and through the large front window, she could see an elderly woman with silver hair working carefully on a client's head. The salon was modest but immaculately clean, with vintage styling chairs and mirrors that reflected warm, golden light. Aiko pressed her face against the glass, watching the woman's hands move with practiced precision. There was something mesmerizing about the careful sectioning, the gentle manipulation of hair that seemed almost like a dance. This was what her mother had done, this careful artistry that transformed not just appearance but confidence itself. The woman inside, Mrs. Sato, according to the sign, looked up and caught sight of Aiko watching through the window. Instead of shooing her away or looking annoyed, she smiled and gave a small wave. Aiko's heart hammered as she realized she'd been caught staring. But something in the woman's kind expression gave her courage. Before she could lose her nerve, she pushed open the door. A small bell chimed overhead, and the scent of lavender shampoo and professional hair products enveloped her like a gentle embrace. It was warm inside, cozy in a way that made her think of what a real home might feel like. "We're closed to walk-ins today, dear," Mrs. Sato called out, without looking up from her client's hair. Her voice was gentle but professional. Then she glanced toward the door and paused, taking in Aiko's appearance. The carefully hidden desperation, the too large school uniform, the hair that spoke of neglect despite obvious attempts at self-care. "I'm not here for service. Aiko said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wondering. I was hoping. She took a shaky breath. Could I work here? Help around your shop? I don't need payment. I just want to learn. Mrs. Sato's weathered hands stilled in her client's hair. The client, a middle-aged woman having her roots touched up, turned to look at Aiko with curious eyes. Learn what exactly? Mrs. Sato asked gently, her tone neither dismissive nor encouraging. Hairstyling, Aiko said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I want to learn everything, how to wash hair properly, how to cut it, how to make people feel beautiful like you do. I can sweep floors, clean mirrors, organize supplies, wash towels, whatever you need. I'll work harder than anyone. I need to learn this. The silence that followed felt eternal. Aiko could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as Mrs. Sato studied her with eyes that seemed to see far more than Aiko was comfortable revealing. What's your name, child? Mrs. Sato asked finally. Aiko Matsumoto. Matsumoto, Mrs. Sato repeated thoughtfully, and something flickered across her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. And why do you want to learn hairstyling? Aiko's throat tightened. How could she explain the boy at the park, the transformation she'd felt, the desperate need to understand her mother's legacy without revealing how broken her current situation was? Someone once helped me with my hair, she said quietly. A stranger who didn't have to care, but did anyway. He made me feel human again. I want to learn how to do that for other people. Mrs. Sato exchanged a meaningful glance with her client, who nodded almost imperceptibly, as if giving some kind of permission. And your family? Mrs. Sato asked carefully. Do they know you're here? Aiko's silence was answer enough. Mrs. Sato sighed softly, continuing her work on her client's hair while she considered. I'll tell you what, she said finally. Come back on Saturday morning at 7 a.m. before I officially open. We'll see how serious you are about this. But I want to be clear, this isn't charity. If you want to learn from me, you'll work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Hair might look simple to outsiders, but it requires discipline, patience, and respect. Can you handle that? Yes, Aiko breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mrs. Sato. I promise you won't regret this. We'll see, the elderly woman said with a small smile. And Aiko? Whatever situation you're dealing with at home, I've been in this business long enough to recognize the signs. Be careful. Some people don't understand that wanting to create beauty in the world isn't a character flaw. As Aiko left the salon, her heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. She had just committed to something that would require her to deceive her aunt, to sneak out of the house before dawn every Saturday, to risk everything for a chance at learning skills that Mariko had explicitly forbidden. But as she walked home through the familiar streets, she thought about the boy at the park, about the gentle patience in his hands as he worked through her tangled hair. He had seen potential in her when she couldn't see it herself. Now Mrs. Sato was offering her a chance to develop that potential, to become someone who could offer the same gift of transformation to others. It was worth the risk. It had to be. Saturday couldn't come fast enough, and Aiko spent the rest of the week planning exactly how she would slip out of the house undetected. Her aunt was a heavy sleeper, especially on weekends when she indulged in more wine than usual. If Aiko was careful, if she was quiet, she could make this work. She was going to learn her mother's craft no matter what it cost her. And maybe, in the process, she would finally understand what had really happened to drive her family apart. The first step toward her future was just days away.